Okay, so here we are for part 2 of our closer look at the classical period. This video should be considerably shorter than part 1. We're going to take a look at the contributions of the three great composers of the period, and then we're going to do a little in-summary review of the classical period music. So the first fellow we have to talk about is Franz Joseph Haydn. As you see, he's in the beginning of the period, 1732 to 1809. Then we're going to talk about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Ludwig van Beethoven. But first, Franz Joseph Haydn. He was definitely the most prolific, meaning he wrote more music than probably any other classical composer. As far as symphonies went, he wrote 104 of them, which is by far the most of any classical composer. He also wrote a lot of string quartets. He wrote some vocal pieces, a couple of oratorios, a few operas, but he was primarily known as a symphonist, a composer who wrote symphonies, and as a string quartet player. As you see here, at 8 years old, he moved to Vienna. At 29, he went into the service of the Esterházy family, which was a noble Hungarian family. They had a residence in Vienna. He was employed by this family for 30 years. It was a great situation. They were very kind and very generous to him, very flexible, very accommodating to him. So he had a great situation there. But he was still essentially a servant of this family, a well-treated servant, a well-paid servant, but he was still a servant. So, as I mentioned earlier in the other video, between these three composers, we're going to see the journey of the role of the composer in classical society and how much it changed between Haydn and Beethoven. So Haydn is representative of the type of relationship that composers had with their employers all the way back to the Middle Ages, where they were just essentially servants of either the church or of the nobility. Now this is much different than our next composer, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Most of you have heard of Mozart. As a boy, he was an incredible prodigy. He was incredibly talented as a musician, a genius, and became very famous as a child performer. His father was a violin teacher, and he promoted Mozart and his sister and took them all around the world, performing for all the kings and queens and royalty of Europe. Now look at some of these bullet points here, just to give you an idea of what an incredible mind Mozart had. By the time he was 6, he could play the harpsichord and violin, improvise fugues, which is no easy task, write minuets, and read music perfectly at first sight. At age 8, he wrote a symphony. You see the rest of these things here. Now, most importantly, these last few bullet points, he was employed for years by the Archbishop of Salzburg in Austria, who did not like Mozart. Now, as Mozart became a young man, he was a difficult personality. He was very precocious, and he was not as famous as he was when he was a child, and he sort of reacted against that. He had a problem with the fact that he wasn't the big star that he was as a child. And in fact, the Archbishop of Salzburg didn't really appreciate him and didn't appreciate his attitude, so he didn't treat him very well. Mozart tried for years to get out of the employ of the Archbishop of Salzburg, and finally at 25 he was literally kicked out the door. And Mozart finally got his wish to go to Vienna and to try to make his living as a freelance composer. Now, this is important, you guys, because for the first time in musical history, we have a composer who's trying to make it on his own, without any patronage, without any sponsorship from the church or from the nobility. So that's an important thing. You remember how Handel, back in the Baroque period, was one of the first composers to open his own and run his own opera companies. He did that with varying degrees of success. Several of them failed, but that was also an early example of a composer trying to stand on their own 2 feet and not be supported by the nobility. So Mozart's time in Vienna, unfortunately, he just spent 10 years there. It began very well for him. It ended not so well. He died alone and in poverty, and was buried in a pauper's grave, an unmarked grave in Vienna somewhere. We don't know where he was buried. His first few years there, he was very successful. He actually met and befriended Haydn, who told Mozart's dad, "Your son is the greatest composer I know, either personally or by reputation." And in 1786, Mozart wrote his masterpiece opera called The Marriage of Figaro. Now, I just want to talk quickly about The Marriage of Figaro. It's important for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is, you remember in the Baroque period, operas typically focused on stories of gods and goddesses or of noble heroes from history. But in The Marriage of Figaro, it's a story about two servants who basically outsmart the count, their employer, who wants to essentially sleep with Susanna, one of the servants, before she gets married to Figaro, one of the other servants, her fiancé. It's a long, convoluted story, and this slide talks about it a little bit. Not this slide. This slide talks about it a little bit more. And there's a link here to the opera. I want you to watch just the first 16, 17 minutes of it. It'll give you a good idea of the plot, of the style, and you can also hear really good examples of recitative and aria. Now, I know that's essentially a Baroque thing that we talked about, but it's also used quite a bit in Mozart's operas. So make sure you have a listen to that. This is just some more information about Mozart and his operas. But for sure, make sure you listen to this link here. First, I'm going to say 17 minutes through Figaro's opening aria. Okay. And now finally, we talk about arguably the greatest composer of all time. Between Beethoven and Bach, it's sort of neck and neck as far as what scholars seem to feel, you know, who the greatest composer was of all time. Beethoven, very importantly, was a bridge composer between the classical period and the Romantic period. He started to introduce elements, an emotional content in music that didn't exist in that classical, in that reasoned, sober, logical, rational type of stylistic approach that was popular in most of the classical period. He started to inject real emotion, real extreme passion in his music, and that's what led into the Romantic period, the next period we're going to talk about. He also knew Mozart and Haydn, and they all three lived in Vienna at the same time, which is unheard of. There's in no other point in musical history do you have three of the greatest composers all living and working in the same city. So for sure, Vienna was known as the musical capital of Europe during the classical period. It was the most important city, just like Paris was the musical capital during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. During his 29th year, Beethoven began to go deaf. And later on in his life, although he was very depressed and was considering suicide, he pulled himself up and he rededicated himself to his music. And even though he was almost entirely deaf, later on in his life, in the last 9 years of his life, he composed two of his greatest pieces, his Ninth Symphony and his Missa Solemnis. He was almost entirely deaf. It's an incredible, incredible accomplishment. Here you've got some more information, specific information about Beethoven's music. He's probably known most for his 9 symphonies. So for sure, I want you to have a listen to some of this Beethoven 9th Symphony. If you can listen to the whole thing, that's great. Here, this link will connect you to a beautiful piano sonata called the Pathétique. Of course, you remember piano sonata means just a solo piano piece. That's all you're going to hear in that piece is a piano alone. And then finally, he was also known for his string quartets, just like Haydn. So there's a nice example of the string quartet here. Make sure you listen to those 3 pieces. And then finally we're going to just summarize the style and elements of classical music. As I said, for the first time, instrumental music became more popular than vocal music. In the classical period, the mood, unlike Baroque music, which if it started happy, it stayed happy. If it started sad, it stayed sad. There was a real consistency of mood, of rhythm, of tempo, of dynamic in Baroque music. That's not the case in classical music. You start to get fluctuations. You start to get louds and softs, all in one movement. You start to get emotional changes and shifts within one movement, from happy to sad, from fast to slow. So that starts in the classical period, and that continues and expands, that whole idea of changing fluctuations within movements. That even expands more in the Romantic period. And you can read the rest of these, but they're basically going along that same idea, that there's a lot more variation in the rhythm, in the dynamics, and especially in the tone color, and the way that the orchestra and the way that the instruments sounded, because we're starting to get we're getting a larger ensemble with an orchestra of 60 people, so obviously you can make a lot more sound. But also instruments are becoming stronger. Their ranges are becoming wider. They can play higher, they can play softer, they can play louder, and they can they can play higher and lower, they can play louder and softer. And also the symphony as a compositional type was able to exploit all the different timbres, all the different sounds and tone colors of all the different instruments. As I said, in the Baroque period, it was mostly string instruments in the orchestra, but now we have all 4 families, strings, brass, woodwinds, and percussion, all equally represented. There's still more strings than anything else, but now all the other families are coming into play, and we're hearing a lot more music that's represented by the different families, not just the string family. Okay, so that's important too, and that's going to also continue and become even more so in the Romantic period. And yeah, the rest of the stuff you can just familiarize yourself with these points, but that's pretty much it. Yep. So again, as usual, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Send me a message on Canvas if anything's confusing to you. I hope these videos help you guys out, as always. And thanks for listening.